Alright, hi everybody, my name is Christina Costa and I am so excited to be talking about bringing research to the classroom today. Just a little tech information. I am sitting to the left so I can hopefully have my slides up here. I have my slides in front of me, so if I look down, that's what I am doing. And I hope you enjoy. Let's get started. I'm really excited to be here. I would like to thank Teacher Magic for including me, as well as the other amazing women that are part of the series. I am really excited for this, and I hope it is everything you ever dreamed of. P.S. I just found an app that makes your phone into a clicker for your computer. So it's called UR. Okay, so today we're going to go over an introduction. We're going to talk about what a buzzword actually is. We're going to be talking about buzzwords in education, some applications of those. Then we're going to move into how you can be the best teacher and researcher possible. And finally, how you can access curriculums and teachers pay teachers resources that get the stuff right. So just to introduce myself, my name is Christina Costa. I sort of got into education in a non-traditional route. My undergrad was cognition and neuroscience, and I loved research from undergrad. Absolutely loved it. I did research in orphanages in Brazil and Sri Lanka. I graduated high school in Brazil, so that's where my interest came from there. And then when it was time to graduate, I was actually going to go back to Brazil and work in orphanages, and my advisor said, we need you here, and there's a lot of stuff that we need here in the United States. Have you ever thought about teaching? And I had not thought about it, but could not have picked a better choice for me. I taught middle school science in Detroit, and now I am back at graduate school at the University of Michigan. I am studying teacher well-being and student well-being. I'm in the psychology department, but I'm working with students and teachers, so really into education. You can find me at Teach Like a Girl on Instagram. I run an Instagram account there. I absolutely love it. Love building community. That's how I found Teacher Magic, how she found me. I post a lot of things about female empowerment. I'm really passionate about female empowerment for young girls. So that's where the name came from. You can also find me on YouTube. I'm Christina Costa on YouTube. I post a lot of stuff, fun stuff, random stuff, some teacher education stuff, nothing like this, but shorter versions, so you can find me there. And I'm going to be talking about research today. I am super passionate about research. I did research when I was an undergrad, like I said, got into the classroom and was consuming a lot of research, but not really looking at it from a researcher's lens. And so now for my time in grad school, it's really opened my eyes to how people who aren't in education, research education, and just how everything gets done and how the process goes is a lot different than I would have thought it was. And it makes me think about my time in the classroom and how I consume that research for myself and my students. So what I want you to get out of this today is how you can apply research into your classroom and how you can really have that critical lens that you need to have. But this is also like a great skill for people to have in general, and also for you to give your students. We'll talk a little bit about that, but students are key, as you know, and this is like a big skill for students to have. So we're going to talk starting with what a buzzword actually is and how it's applied to education. So I like to think of buzzwords basically as a word that you could ask any teacher in the United States and they would be like, yep, I heard that, or yep, I've seen that in my school. It's a word or a phrase that is popular at a certain point in time. Doesn't necessarily mean bad. Doesn't necessarily mean not a thing, just means that it's a popular word at the time. And none of these are inherently bad things. I'm kind of going to echo that throughout the talk, but none of these words are bad. We're just going to really think about how they're applied to education. So now we're going to talk about specific buzzwords for education, and I call this growth mindset, grit, and learning styles. Oh my, there are lots of them, but here are just a few examples. And so to start, we're going to think about power posing. This does not have to do with education, but it's a really good way to frame this talk and frame what we're going to be talking about. Okay, power posing. This is Amy Cuddy. She is a social psychologist. She used to work at Harvard as a professor, and you might or may not have seen this TED Talk. So you might or might not have seen this TED Talk. I saw this TED Talk way back when I was in high school, and I remember seeing it and being like, yes. A lot of TED Talks, we think about that, right? We watch them, we're like, yes, this is everything I need, and we do whatever they say, right? So her basic premise, if I can't play this, her basic premise is that there are different poses. And they are ascribed to body language, right? So if I'm posing like this, that's going to give me confidence, that's going to raise up my testosterone, and when I'm sitting like this, it's going to do the opposite. So what she did in her experiment was she had two groups of participants. One group of participants stand in power poses, one stand in these poses, and a control just normal. Then she asked them to do a psychological stress test. This is a famous psychological stress test, and it's incredibly stressful. It's where you ask participants to go in a room and deliver a speech in front of a panel, and the entire panel has blank faces. They don't nod, they don't smile, they're literally standing there like this while you give a speech. And it's terrifying. And we find that it increases stress, it increases heart rate. All of those signs of chronic stress are going to go up. The signs of acute stress are going to go up while you ask participants to do something like this. So she asked these participants to do that, and what she found was that the participants who had stood in power pose show like a mitigated effect. And what she implies in very careful language is that before you do an interview, before you give a talk, you should be kind of like standing in these power poses, and that's going to help you. I kid you not. Before my teaching interview, I stood in the bathroom stall, which is what articles say to do based on the TED Talk, in this power pose before I did my interview. So the implications of this, right, are that people across America are standing in these power poses thinking that this is going to boost their confidence. When a couple months later, this study is replicated in Europe, and this scientist did not find the same results. And so Amy Cuddy says, okay, you know, different context, maybe, different experiment, you didn't do everything I did, not a big deal. Again, another study finds that they didn't find the same effects, another study, another study, another study. And now, all of a sudden, we have a handful of studies that say, I'm not finding the same results as Amy did, right? And this is not to say at all that what Amy Cuddy did was wrong, or that she fudged her data, or that she did anything wrong, but it's to say that context really, really matters. And for some reason, in whoever her participants were, that worked, and that's what happened to the participants, but we're not finding that it happens all over. So that was kind of the beginning of what scientists are now calling the replication crisis, that a lot of these classic experiments that we base literature off of and psychological behaviors off of are not necessarily replicating in different contexts and different situations. So now we bring it to education. I'm going to walk through a couple of examples in order to ground this, and then we're going to talk about the implications of this. So learning styles is another one. Even one that when I was teaching I really thought of and that I really resonated with as a student, and this is the idea, right, that people have different types of learning styles. Some people are visual, some people are auditory. But what we find, in 2015 this study came out, is that learning styles might not be as much of a thing as we think it is. And that's not to say that there aren't specific learning styles, but it is to say that it might not increase student motivation, or it might not be the best way to increase student motivation in the classroom. And this article actually says scientific support for these theories is lacking, and we suggest that educators' time and energy are better spent on other theories that might aid instruction. And that's huge too. I mean, I even said something, I think my second year as a teacher, along with learning styles, and someone said, actually, learning styles aren't really a thing anymore. And I was like, what? And it's funny how you can really, something can be really salient to you, and it's really hard to admit the fact that maybe it's not as much a thing as you thought it was. I still to this day am like, I'm a visual learner, I'm a visual learner, I'm a visual learner, but maybe it's not best for me to go in my classroom, and for some students that it might be better to educate them as a whole. So that was another finding. Another example is growth mindset. Growth mindset is really what inspired me to do this whole talk. This is a buzzword that everybody knows, and this is a buzzword that had me shook when I came into grad school and started really researching about growth mindset. Like, shook to the core. So for those that aren't familiar, this idea comes from Carol Dweck, another social psychologist in California. And the initial idea behind growth mindset is something that's been on for a really long time. It's something that's been here for a really, really long time. It's something that is not new, and is something that Carol Dweck has been developing for years and years and years, and borrowed from other theories years and years and years prior to that. And so what she says in her TED Talk too, again, I'll paste it if I can, is the basic idea that she was observing students, and she noticed that some really had a tough time accepting challenges and some did not. And so what happens from this is that a scientific study from the social psychology field, this isn't even from education psychology, is applied to education, and then it is blown out of proportion. And since Carol Dweck has come out with this idea, she has said, and she comes out with this idea of a false mindset that is a complete misunderstanding of what she originally meant. And these are things like false praise, right? If we're constantly praising students just for their effort and not for the results, it might in fact hinder students. Another thing she has said is that nobody has a growth mindset all of the time, and in fact a fixed mindset might be necessary in certain situations. Another thing Carol Dweck has said is that growth mindset does not work in all situations, in all contexts, and she also is concerned that some educators are taking it to mean consolation prizes for students, and that's not necessarily what her intent was, right? So the idea behind growth mindset is still the same, is still salient, is still important, but the way some educators have adapted to it might not only be not relevant to students, but might be hurtful to students. So in her paper, she gives the example of a teacher who constantly is praising for effort, and the kid keeps failing the test, failing the test, failing the test. It's like, at what point is praising the effort maybe not okay anymore? Another thing she's talked about is like educators who might, innocently by the way, use growth mindset for a child who might actually need extra help, you know, like maybe child's having struggle, and instead of realizing like what that struggle is or why that children might be struggling, we're like, oh, we need to have like a growth mindset about that. Another example, I have two more examples, the example of grit. So Angela Duckworth, another social psychologist, but she actually was a middle school teacher for a very long time, came out with this idea of grit. And she says that she observed students in Chicago public schools, and she observed people who were in the Army, and that this key characteristic, this grit, is the combination of passion and perseverance, and that this combination is really great for students and is the key, not the key and not the only, but a significant reason for the students who succeed maybe above their expectations. And Duckworth is talking about this idea of grit. Again, a couple years later, when people start to examine it, NPR comes out with an article that's the power and problem of grit, and if you haven't listened to that, I would really suggest listening to that. We have people saying, okay, what's wrong with grit? When is grit appropriate? When is it a term that we should be using with our students? And it kind of pushes home an idea, again, another idea of like, can grit really explain everything about students who succeed? And so I would really highly suggest watching that. Again, it's a similar concept that someone come out with this great idea, and it's applied into situations that might not be appropriate for it to be applied to. And all of a sudden we have some educators saying that students need to be grittier, and we have schools adopting grit as a character strength when the actual grit has not even been validated yet. The scale to measure grit has not even been validated. Another thing that Angela even says is like, I observe this in students. I don't know how to make students grittier. And what ends up happening is like this loose thread comes in and applies that and says, this is how you make students grittier, when the original researcher hasn't really even said anything about that yet. And so that's kind of problematic and out of her hands, out of Carol Dweck's hands, when people take their work and apply it to situations, and then it kind of explodes and becomes a buzzword. Last example, this is like a personal example for me, but we were thinking about, up until now, we've been thinking about research. And I also just want to lightly touch on this about things that maybe haven't even been researched. So in my school, it was, I don't want to say value, but it was expected that students would sit and slant. This is a technique from Teach Like a Champion as well. And if people are familiar, it's an acronym basically for sitting up, listening, nodding, tracking, and basically sitting like this at all times. And you can see some pretty crazy videos of students sitting like this. It's a little bit weird. It might not be for everybody, but it's something that made me feel uncomfortable and something that I really didn't want to do in my classroom. I didn't want to have my students sit like this. I had middle schoolers. They didn't want to sit like this all the time. I didn't really see a problem if a student was leaning forward and still listening or leaning backward and writing. That just wasn't something that was important to me, but it was something that pushed on to me. That was one of the first times that I asked myself, why am I having students sit like this? And as a researcher, I'm reading this technique and I'm wondering, like, where's the research that's telling me, repeated research that's telling me that kids sitting like this is going to make them perform better? And why isn't this technique being transmitted across all schools? And why is it a certain type of school where kids are sitting in slant? And so that like really was the first example to me when I've been reflecting now as a researcher, like what are other things that we do or that maybe people tell us to do that we're not really sure there's a reason behind it, and we're not really sure it's even good for our students, and what do we do in that situation? You know, if I could do it all over again, I would ask somebody, why are we having our students sit in slant? Where's the research that tells me that sitting in slant is good for students? Where's the research that tells me that sitting in slant for Michigan students is good and replicated in research? And where's the study telling me that kids in Detroit should be sitting in slant and will have better outcomes? Like, I wanted to know that information, and I kind of regret it to this day that I initially just stopped doing it, but I always think about that, like, why do we have students sit in slant? So what's the whole so what behind this, right? A lot of these things and a lot of these buzzwords are positive, right? Grit is positive. It's passion and perseverance. Growth mindset is positive. And so a question that I have gotten asked before is, are there negative implications to this research, or maybe is it just like a waste of time if I'm not fully understanding what's behind this? You know, maybe you make kids sit in slant for a month, but was it bad for them? You know, because there's a difference between doing something that's pointless, I mean, I think that's still bad too, personally as a teacher, and doing something that might be harmful to students. And so for this I have a really great example, and this is called relevance theory. So relevance theory is the idea that if you have students connect what they're learning to their personal lives, they will understand it better. So not just like taking math examples and doing them as pizza, but like saying, why does this math apply to my life? And that answer is going to be different for every student. So one of the principal findings of this is on a college campus, and they had psychology students. Half of them, the control condition, didn't do anything, and half of them took the psychology concepts that they learned in class and applied them to their own life in an essay. And what they found was that the students who did that performed better on their final exam. So when you hear that, that sounds great, and you're like, yes, I'm going to have my students write an essay about why this applies to their life, it's going to help them, etc., etc. And it does sound great. Another replicated study worked with high school students. And again, it was half and half, and they had students in this condition write about why this material is important to their life. And what they found was the students who wrote about what was important to their life did worse on the final than the other group of students. And that was a very, very interesting finding, and it was opposite what the other researchers found. When they looked at the essays of the students, they noticed that students who didn't think it was relevant to their life at all were ruminating on why it wasn't relevant instead of ruminating on why it was relevant, and therefore they did better on the exam. So that's like a simple example of all about context, right? Groups of students, you can have a research finding and it can be relevant to one group of students and it can not be relevant to another group of students. And that's really, really important to keep in mind. You know, one of the problems with research that I've learned as a researcher is that the stuff that gets published is not necessarily the stuff where you do an experiment and you find out the opposite effects, or you find out there is no effect at all. And that's still important to know, right? If you run an experiment and you find there's no finding, that's important to publish. But often it's the stuff that's really interesting that gets published. And so it's really hard as a teacher to see a piece of research or be told to do something and really understand if that's going to be relevant for your students. So the question that we need to ask ourselves continually is, does this work for me? Does this work for us? And it's a really, really simple question. And the thing about teachers, amazing, amazing teachers, is that we have amazing gut feelings. And we know when something maybe isn't relevant for our students. And so I really want you to work on trusting that gut and trusting that understanding, and pushing the envelope to thinking about, is this relevant to my students? Is this even relevant at all? And are there negative implications? I've already told you that I had my kids sit in slant, and I don't necessarily think it was relevant for my students. I use growth mindset all the time, and thinking back on it, we'll get to this in a second, but there are a million ways to use growth mindset in the perfect way for your students. But when I reflect and think about how I use growth mindset, I'm not exactly sure if it was helpful for my students or not, if that makes sense. And that's okay. So if I don't want anyone to feel bad if they use the word grit, if they use growth mindset, if they have their kids sit and slant. This isn't about feeling bad. This is about like pushing buttons and figuring out what works for your students. And what I'm doing really helpful, and do I maybe need to research it more? So now we're going to be talking about like how to be a responsible teacher researcher, because you and your kids need it. Something I always do when I hear a buzzword, when I hear something people are talking about all the time, when I hear something that someone tells me to do in my classroom, in education, this is so simple, is Googling it and finding it out for yourself. Because the sheet of information that you get at PD is going to support what you're supposed to be doing. That's just human nature. And so something really important that I do is I want to make sure that I'm looking up all the time. Let's take the example of culturally responsive teaching, a great thing. I want to be looking up, number one, how to implement culturally responsive teaching. I also want to look up how to not implement culturally responsive teaching, because I know there's a way to do it wrong. There has to be. And what is that way, and how can I not do that for my students? How has it been done right? How has it been done wrong? And is this a thing? Google Scholar is an amazing resource. Then I can really look at the actual research behind culturally responsive teaching, and I can look it up and see the experiments of when it's helpful for students and when it's not by using the same resources. The only problem with Google Scholar, I will say, is that if you don't work with research regularly, you might not have access to certain articles, but you will always be able to see the abstract, and the abstract is going to tell you the most information. Lazy Scholar extension is a Google Chrome extension, and it will search for you the free research that you can read. Another thing people really forget about is if you did a grad school program, a master's program, even your undergrad, your logins might still work for those. Mine has since I graduated undergrad. If you go through your university's Google Scholar site, you can often get access to these things for free. This is something that drives me absolutely insane, is when people say to students like, don't use Google. Are you serious? What adult do you know that does not use Google? It's so important to teach our students how to use Google in the right way. Even for yourself, when you're Googling how to implement culturally responsive teaching, you know, in your head, you go through a process that you learn somewhere, right? You're skipping the Yahoo answers. You're skipping things that look like maybe they're just blog posts and don't show research or don't show any links whatsoever. You need to teach that to your students too. And the sooner they learn how to do that, the better off they're going to be. And that goes right into scaffolding, researching for your students. So practicing scaffolding, asking your students, first having them come up with a research question, showing them both sides. And that's one of the things that's really important to teach students, is finding both sides. That is something that we as adults don't even do most of the time, right? We find sources to support our own conclusion, but it's really important to teach our students, and for us to do ourselves, find the opposite conclusion as well, and be able to look at that critically, because if you can look at that critically, that will support your argument both sides. I love this quote. I hope you can see this quote. Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose. Don't keep this information yourself. Share with your students. English, science, math, it doesn't matter. You can be a researcher in any field, and we need researchers in all fields. Really quick and easy things you can bring to your classroom is asking your students, how do you know that? When they say things. Any subject again, how do they know? They need to be able to say how they know. We need to hold people accountable, like our president, for example, of when they say things, proving behind it. Prove it. That's the other one, is prove it. I use sign language in my classroom all the time, and I would always just say, okay, prove it. It's asking the same question in a really simple and easy way, and then when you hear your students saying that to other students, it will be the best day of your life. And then, again, knowing both sides is crucial. Teach them to know both sides. Say, what about the opposite? That will be really helpful. So let's quickly end with talking about so I have this information. I know that growth mindset can be interpreted different ways. I know grit may be interpreted different ways. What about all these other buzzwords I'm hearing all the time? How do I find resources, or how do I create resources that are going to be getting the research right, so I know I'm having the best outcome for my students? Those not familiar with TPT is Teachers Pay Teachers. It's just a website where teachers can buy and sell resources. And there's a lot of information in there. If we do a really quick search, we find Growth Mindset has 5,000 resources. Learning Styles has over 30,000 resources. Grit has 400 resources. That's a lot for all of those. So, when I'm trying to find something, and here you can substitute resource for curriculum, maybe if you're given curriculums. I personally use TPT all the time. It saved my life. I didn't have a curriculum. I bought Chris Kessler's science stuff, and I used that, and it was a lifesaver. A theme that's come across this whole talk too, right, is, do you think that a lot of these resources got it right and are going to be helpful to my students? Yeah. How do I find, though, what's right and what might not be useful to my students? We don't have to use the words right and wrong. We can use, how do I find the resources that are relevant to my students? And also create, if we have any creators out there. And the answer is it's really, really simple, and it's a lot simpler than we think or know. Research never ends, and that's a beautiful thing about it. No one is pushing out ideas that they think are going to be harmful to students. But things change. And context changes a lot. Even in the same state, even in the same city, even in the same school, students are learning in different ways. We know that. It's one of the toughest parts about being a teacher. But understanding the research behind it. Something I look for is, has the resource or has the curriculum cited scientific evidence? Is it in the product description? Is it in the preview? Is it in my curriculum on the back page? Is it citing resources and research? If it is, that's probably a really good mark that somebody has looked this stuff up to support what they're producing. That's one example. Downloading previews are really helpful because you can see, how certain things are implemented. Let's take growth mindset, for example, right? If we know it's not necessarily good all the time to be praising kids for their effort, and we know that might not work in certain contexts, then maybe I'm not going to buy a resource that's all about praise. Maybe I'm going to buy a bulletin board, and I really like the message of the bulletin board, and it says growth mindset, and that's okay, and I like the message that that bulletin board has, and I think my students are really going to enjoy it. That's probably a good resource, and probably minimal negative consequences, if any negative consequences at all. Research is changing all the time, so be responsible, look these things up, pay attention to things. If you hear something from your principal, if you hear something in PD, look it up during PD. You're an adult, you can do that. Look up where it's gone wrong, and you can educate the people around you. Hey, I don't think this is going to work for our students because so-and-so, this happened, or somewhere, which is kind of like our school, it didn't really work and it had negative consequences. You can use your voice and you can speak up. If you hear something and you're skeptical, it's probably for a reason, so listen to your voice. Somebody has to stand up for our students, and somebody has to be the voice. And if we're all passively taking in information and not really thinking about what we're putting out, it's a big burden to bear, and it's a lot to be thinking about constantly. So if you don't understand something, please don't be afraid to ask an adult for proof too. If somebody said something to me, if I said something and someone said, hey, how do you know that? That might make me stop and think, wait, how do I actually know that? Did I look it up? If I didn't, that's growth for both me and the other person. I'm just going to finish with a quick little anecdote. And that anecdote is that my school also, alongside SLANT, they said everybody has to be doing a silent do now. So right, the kids are walking to the classroom, has to be 100% silent. If it's not, make them do it again, do it again, do it again. They're answering this question that's on the board, which I loved, has to be silent. And so I really liked the piece where the students were coming in and answering a question on the board, but I hated that it had to be silent because my students were coming from lunch, they were coming from the hallway, they're middle schoolers, they like to talk to each other, they're social people, and I didn't like that it had to be silent, but I kept doing it, and it really started to bear a toll on myself, my physical self, because I would just get stressed out every time a class entered. And we had teaching coaches, and my teaching coach was in the room, and after, I'll never forget, we had this conversation, and he was like, how do you think the lesson went, blah, 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 and without even talking about the lesson, I said, oh, it's so frustrating that my do nows aren't silent. And he said, why do they have to be silent? And I said, because then they're focused. And he said, did they do it? I said, yeah. Did they complete it? Yeah. Were they good answers? Yeah. Did you have a fruitful conversation after? Yeah. So why does it have to be silent? And I was like, because they told me that it has to be silent. And he said, don't let somebody tell you something to be true. Figure it out for yourself. And that's just one example of a million things I did as a teacher, where I would have research articles printed out on my clipboard, and if someone questioned what I was doing, I would be like, this is why I'm doing this. Mindful coloring and mindful meditation. This is why I'm doing this. Not because there's an article on ABC that says good for my students, because this researcher did it here, they found that students' test scores improved, blah, 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 blah. This is why I'm doing this. If you can argue this, then I'll think about it, but for now, this is why I'm doing this. So I just like to leave everybody on that note, is that if you're uncomfortable with something, if you don't think something's relevant to your students, figure it out for yourself. I know we have a million things to do as teachers, but if it's something that you don't think is right for your students, that you don't think is working for your students, just figure it out yourself, and that will be great. Since this recording is not live, I welcome you to send me any questions you have by email. I'm teachlikeagirl@gmail.com. DMs on Instagram. I always answer my DMs on Instagram. Any questions on YouTube. I hope this was really relevant and useful for you, and will just help you start thinking about research and how it's implemented. I could talk about this for probably 5 hours, and it's really difficult for me to condense to 30 minutes. So if that's something you're interested, please email me. I'd love to email you. Thank you again so much for doing this and being a part of this program. I am just blown away by the different topics and different ideas of this group of women, and I am so proud of you for taking your time, whether it was your principal's money, whether it was your own money, and investing in professional development for yourself. That's awesome. That is why I will just say another quick anecdote. I came into grad school thinking, I'm studying student development, I'm studying youth development, positive youth development, youth well-being, and really focusing on that, especially young girls. And when my advisor said, I want you to research teachers, I said, okay, like I'll do it to start. It's probably easier to research adults. And I just have loved it because teachers are the most amazing humans on the planet. They have to take care of themselves, their families, their students. They are caregivers. Being a caregiver is tough. So thank you so much for being a teacher. Thank you for working with your students every single day. Thank you for just showing up. I appreciate and love every single one of you just for being a teacher. I know it's hard work, but it's worth it, and I'm so excited. So that being said, please follow me on all my social media. Teach Like a Girl on Instagram, Christina Costa on YouTube. I am going to be doing some experiments and some research involving my following in the future. So if you would like to contribute to research, I promise I will keep everyone up to date with like what I find. And I think that's a really cool way for teachers to like understand. I'm interested in teacher well-being. I can't really talk about it because I'm researching it. Ethics, people, ethics. So thank you so much again. I am so excited to be part of this. Any questions, email me, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye!